I had been in these online Facebook groups where we supported other kidney donors for long enough to know that you could also donate a section of liver. Very, very different procedure. It's a full abdominal opening. It's a 4 to 6 months to full recovery. There's only about 120 of us who have both donated kidney and liver. And I was stuck. How could I, as a healthy young person without kids, hold on to something that would be an inconvenience, in this case, not a minor inconvenience, but would only be an inconvenience and could save somebody else's life?
Welcome to the Philanthropy Masterminds podcast, brought to you by DonorSearch, the show that takes you inside the lives of thought leaders, innovators, and changemakers in fundraising, philanthropy, and civil society. I'm your host, Jay Frost. Anthony Cernera is dedicated to understanding how humans learn, grow, heal, and change. A 3-time living organ donor, public speaker, consultant, researcher, and psychotherapist, Anthony has also led high-performing development teams for over 16 years, managing campaigns from $25 million to $600 million. When not helping others, he volunteers in hospice care, instructs meditation, and competes as a skydiver, holding gold and silver medals in the USPA National Skydiving Championships. We spoke with Anthony on the eve of the latest phase of his epic journey.
Well, that's an interesting place to explore first, maybe.
Well, I'm probably not in a position to make a broad sweeping statement about that. I would say at least socially in Connecticut, it feels like there were absolutely, right? We had the Jewish country club, we had the Protestant country club, we had the country club that eventually in the 70s let the Catholics in, but the Jews weren't allowed in until the 90s, right? So I'm certainly not making a commentary on, the world landscape where religion continues to be a dividing line, but it feels like socially, at least in Connecticut, it's more acceptable to have friends who are not sharing the same faith as maybe 50, 60 years ago.
And you come at that also from both an interesting background as well as your own personal exploration today. So you are a Buddhist, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
How did you find your way towards Buddhism? Because you have a Catholic background, I believe, also.
Yeah, so I was lucky in a couple of ways, and it's interesting, a little bit of an intersection with my professional career as well. So grew up in a family that identified as Catholic. My father is a PhD in theology, and religion is a pretty big part of his life. We spent 8 weeks a year in a Benedictine monastery for the whole of my childhood, 6 weeks in the summer while he was teaching a summer course, and Christmas and Easter weeks. So I grew up around monasteries, and there were a lot of church people, and there was...
what was that like?
I can tell you how to shear a sheep. It was a little isolating as a kid. My friends would go off to summer camps and hang out with their friends, and it was me and my 3 siblings in the middle of nowhere. But it's part of why my siblings and I are so close. And we had a library card and not much else. There were no TVs or radios. So I think, as you can tell by some of my books behind me here, it definitely built a lifelong love for reading. But monasteries are fascinating places, and for people who don't have experience in them, I think they're missing a very wonderful place of renewal and creativity and our humanity. I think people think of monasteries as very isolating, quiet places, but they tend to be, yes, most monasteries, regardless of the tradition, have a lot of contemplation and meditation sort of at the core of it. And there's something sacred and special about that. And out of that foundation, what you discover is this, beautiful world. It attracts artists, it attracts academics, it attracts spiritual seekers and community-minded folks and people who want to make the world a little bit of a better place. So the community has sort of been involved pretty meaningfully in both a Benedictine monastery of my childhood, and then trained for 7 years as a student of a Zen Buddhist monastery in upstate New York myself. Monasteries are some of the most vibrant and lively and fascinating, enriching places I've ever been connected to. So, yeah, as a kid, I maybe didn't appreciate it, but as an adult, I'm deeply grateful to have had those relationships and that experience.
So how did you make that discovery of Buddhism personally, and then decide to take that leap of spending time within, that Zen Buddhist spiritual center?
I'm very lucky. My mother is a daughter of Lutheran pastor and pastor's wife, and they were missionaries. My mother and both my uncles were born in Africa in the 50s. And my grandparents, to give you a sense of what kind of Christians they were running educational programs in the late 60s, trying to normalize having gay children for their parishioners, that God loved them and they were, creation of his, and, how could they not be loved and accepted and supported as part of our families? And so they were always kind of on that cutting edge of acceptance and trying to widen the circle, I think capture the best of what I see in the Christian tradition. And my grandfather participated in interreligious dialogue. He was actually on a nationally, I couldn't tell you the name of it, syndicated TV show. It was him as a Protestant minister, a rabbi, and a Catholic priest. And they met weekly for something like 20 episodes a year for a couple of years. And it was just exploration of faith. I mean, can you imagine that, like, broadcast TV in the 1970s, and you've got people just having these open conversations about spirituality?
Yeah, I can almost imagine that at 7 a.m. Yes, that's a Connecticut show. I can see that in my mind's eye.
So I got this very open tradition from that side of the family. And then my father, even though incredibly devout, Catholic, when he was 7 years old, he used to walk himself to daily mass, and, his family was convinced he was going to be a Catholic priest. And I think there was a very serious time that he considered that. He was also really, in his academic career, there were a ton of projects that he was involved in. But one of the first centers he started at Sacred Heart University was the Center for Christian-Jewish Dialogue. So he was fascinated into religious dialogue as well. So I kind of got this openness to other religious traditions from both sides of the family that recognized an interesting dialectic, kind of two sides of this same coin. That on one hand, you can say things that are kind of universal, like, different paths up the same mountain, right? We're all exploring our humanity. We're all looking at what's our meaning and purpose in this world. There are themes, and particularly you see this in monasteries, that when you strip away dogma and kind of ideology, you get to a very common human experience at the core of our spirituality. So there's this one side of interreligious dialogue that is very universalist. And then there's this flip side of really celebrating and respecting very serious differences between those traditions. So I have this interreligious thing on both sides of the family. So there was an openness. It was very clear to me. Oh, wow. Can I tell you a defining spiritual story? Can I go on a little bit of a...
Please, yeah.
So I'm 9 years old. My great-grandmother, Grandma Lucy, so my father's grandmother on the Italian side of the family, she passed away. It was extraordinary, great life, 98 years old. She was my only living grandparent, or great-grandparent, especially on that side of the family. And I loved her. Sunday meatballs, one of my very first memories is as a 3-year-old running and hitting a coffee table with my shin. And she rolled up the newspaper and was swatting the coffee table, bad coffee table. I mean, she was just this, right out of central casting of the perfect Italian grandmother. And that was my first real loss as a 9-year-old, grandma passing away. So I was sad about it for a few months. The joke in my family is I didn't eat pasta with tomato sauce on it for 6 months after her death because it wasn't her tomato sauce. So I was now doing butter and pasta, which for an Italian family was tantamount to a war crime. So I was experiencing that loss, and we were at the Benedictine monastery for Christmas week. And at like 2 o'clock in the morning, I go and wake my parents up. I'm sad that Grandma Lucy is dead. My father says, Anthony, go back to your room. You can say a prayer and talk to Grandma Lucy in heaven. So I go back to my room and I kneel next to the side of my bed and I start to pray. And I had what was for me my first profound spiritual experience. And that experience was of nothing, of a void. I understood in this very profound way that in my world view, there's nothing there. That dead is dead, that it's, you're gone. There was no heaven, there was no God. It was this very, some people talk about spiritual experiences that are connecting to a tradition. Mine was very much the opposite direction. So I love spirituality. I recognize its centrality and importance in our life, and yet knew very deeply from a young age that I was not a theist. So started dabbling in Buddhism a little bit as a teenager. But then I was working in the Center for Christian Jewish Understanding that my father started. It was my first major gift officer job, and met a couple Buddhists, started getting really intrigued. At that time, I was having a little bit of a rough time in my life. I was 25 years old, new job, just starting in fundraising, recently got married, bought a house. Like, I was stressed out. And if you're feeling like you're suffering, a Buddhist message of life is filled with suffering and there is a path to liberation suddenly seems really interesting. So it was working at that Center for Christian Jewish Understanding, kind of a little hardship in life. This family mix got me to, meeting a new tradition. 2009, I got very connected to the Zen Buddhist monastery, Zen Mountain Monastery in Mount Tremper, New York. Ended up taking vows there, practiced as a lay student for 5 years pretty rigorously until 2015, and loved it. It was just, Zen Buddhism is a great gateway drug to Buddhism for Catholics. It looks very familiar. You have smells and bells and incense, and there's kind of a service on Sunday mornings that has like, a Dharma talk very similar to a homily in the middle of it. The ritual, sort of the clarity of how to approach Buddhism is so different than the Western traditions. To be able to have a religious tradition that doesn't necessarily have a God at the center of it, or and yet is still deeply spiritual. And I would even, if we're going to draw a distinction between spirituality and religion, it is very much a religion. This is, a deep tradition with a lot of wisdom that really looks at the big issues of meaning and purpose and what do we do with our finite, sort of fragile, very special time on this planet. So yeah, that's sort of the mini version of it.
There's a lot baked into that, which it'd be interesting to kind of explore. And when you talked about going into your first development job, it wasn't just your first development job with a new house and a new wife and all the things, which sounds like a lot of pressure, as you said. It was also working for your father. It sounds like that relationship was close, but I can imagine that could be sometimes challenging, especially when your dad's your boss. And when it's a spiritual center and you're going through your own kind of journey. If you had that experience of what you described as a void at 9, and you're working with your father whose whole life is dedicated to this kind of Christian religious experience, or at least understanding of the faith, what was that like? First of all, how did you choose to do that? And then what was that like working for him in your first development job of all things?
Yeah, so I should probably give a little more detail to that beginning of the career. I'm one of the few fundraisers who can say he wanted to be a fundraiser one day. My father was a VP of development for Marist, and then he was president of Sacred Heart University for 22 years. So when there was Take Your Student to Work day when I was in 4th or 5th grade, I spent the day with my dad, and I watched him solicit one of the board members for $100,000 over lunch. And I just thought that was the coolest thing. I mean, here I am, 10, 11 years old, and like, I made $100,000 in the early 90s. What does that even mean? It seemed like $1 billion for all I knew. Um, and just listening to the conversations they've had. I mean, Jay, you know what it's like to be in the room with donors. You're talking about, it's not just intimate because it's money. And I think for people who are outside of development, they get kind of fixated on that, this like discomfort about talking about money. But transformative philanthropy, we're talking about our deepest yearnings for what a better future looks like. We're talking about our family of origins and what drives us to try to make the world a little better place. It's beautifully intimate work. So that sort of planted the seed. Went around life. I thought when I first got to college, I might want to be in, broadcast journalism or something. Because I was a part-time student, I was a little bit older than some of my classmates. And so I was getting to know the faculty and staff better. And I went to Sacred Heart where my father was president. And as I was getting to the end of college, I sort of reconnected with this idea, that fundraising thing seemed pretty cool. I love being on a college campus. I almost don't want to graduate. I don't want to leave. And by the way, everybody here seems pretty happy. Nobody's a millionaire, but they're clearly living comfortably. They go home at reasonable hours. Like, the universities are vibrant and wonderful, spaces to be in. So I got an internship in my alumni relations office that turned into a temporary job just before I graduated. I had a 3-month contract to be the director of annual giving because the previous director was going on maternity leave. And then I'm not going to lie, I probably, with the exact same name as the president of the university, I probably had a little bit of an advantage going into the interview process because I then was hired for that director of annual giving job right out of college. So started out in annual giving there, transitioned after a few years. The Center for Christian Jewish Understanding was my first major gift officer job.
I'm also kind of marveling at being in a Center for Christian Jewish or Jewish Christian Understanding, especially given our current context. And I'm not talking about politics here, but rather just how people of different faiths interact. And you set this stage a little bit as we began the conversation talking about what Connecticut was like. Very helpful for our audience who didn't live there that time. I remember it a little bit. I don't have a terrific memory, but I remember that experience a little bit of what it was like to have these invisible separations in a place that was small. So small that it seems ridiculous there would be any separation at all. So being in a place like that, a Catholic center, and with the Center for Jewish Christian Understanding, what was that like? And when you think about that going forward, how did that experience manifest itself for you, if at all?
Yeah. One quick note, because I got into the biographical piece, but you had asked me sort of about the relationship about working with my father. So I do, if I can, just take a quick step back to that.
Oh,
working with my father was an extraordinary privilege. It was, he was great at what he did. He took a nearly bankrupt institution to this, incredibly vibrant, largest Catholic university in the Northeast. It was great getting to see what he did. And even though he was always the father who, when I was a kid, I'd called him at the office every day, and his admin always interrupted him and he came and talked to me for a couple of minutes, regardless of what he was doing. And as a kid, I just thought that was normal. It's as an adult now that I'm like, oh my God, the meetings he must have been stepping out of on like a random occasion when I was calling him. So he was always very present, but university presidents work like, 80 hours a week, right? So other than being up in the monastery or Sunday meals where he was very religiously present, getting to work with him and get to be on donor visits with him and sit in meetings with him was this really beautiful way of, as an adult, connecting with him. So that was joyful. It was hard. The only piece of it was hard was a lot of contention around the end of his time there. And it really taught me an important lesson that I know we aren't going to talk about politics today, but it's a truth I try to hold. Both with some major functions that had happened over the university in the 5 years I was there, but then also around some of the issues with his retirement. I would pick up a newspaper and it would talk about something that I knew because I was either in the room or sitting around the dinner table, talking about it with family, and just how wrong the news media would get it. And at that time, I was a media studies major and really interested in journalism. And I try to extrapolate that lesson into my adulthood that like our reporters are great and they're getting it mostly right most of the time. But 30-40% of every article that I had intimate knowledge of was like deeply incorrect. So there was a beautiful learning lesson there. So yeah, actually, other than being rank and file and sometimes hearing the boss being talked about badly about, who's my dad, there was no hardship working for him. It was really actually quite a beautiful experience. To talk about the segmentation, I think Connecticut is a fascinating place. I've lived in Long Island, done some fundraising there, and Pennsylvania as well. So I have a little bit of experience in other areas in the Northeast. Connecticut is a kind of consolidated extreme version of the rest of the country in one place. We have exactly 1% of the population. There's 3.6 million people out of a country of, 340 million. We have 3 of the top 10 richest towns in the country. We have 3 of the top 10 most under-resourced cities in the country. The wealth disparity here, because of some of the extraordinary wealth with the billionaires, is more extreme in the rest of the country, but as a percentage of the population, and the divide between the working class and the ultra-rich really is representative of what the United States is like as a whole. And so I have this deep belief, both because of some of the previous work I've done in philanthropy, but then especially now as I look forward to making an impact in mental health care space. If we can fix sort of big structural problems here in Connecticut, I think it's the perfect laboratory for the rest of the country. I grew up in Fairfield, beautiful, 6-bedroom home with an acre lot at the end of a cul-de-sac. I mean, idyllic, right? Beautiful. We always had food in the kitchen, all of the privileges that go with being born into a relatively, I'm going to call it wealthy based on some of the donors we work with, but certainly the top end of upper middle class. Exactly 1.7 miles from where I live is the closest project in Bridgeport, the Barnum projects. If you were born there, as opposed in my zip code, your life expectancy is 17 and a half years shorter. And fortunately, I was involved in a family that was deeply motivated by their Christian faith to address, poverty and inequities and social injustice. So if you can have this extraordinary basket of a plenty of money, a wealth of education and resources, just deep security in some of our rich towns, and then all the vulnerability and fragileness of the folks that are struggling, that are literally our neighbors. If we can fix it here, I think we can fix it as a country. I think if we can figure out how to leverage the strengths we have to support those people who are struggling the most. So Connecticut's a microcosm. So that separation, seeing the wounds of like still knowing which country club is the Jewish country club versus the, all that kind of stuff, like those divides are still there. But it's the geography, that when I drive, 20 minutes on I-95 and I can go through such extraordinary wealth to under-resourced communities, to extraordinary wealth to under-resourced communities, it is a reminder of what big work we still have to do as a country for creating equality and a better opportunity for people.
As you talk about this, it strikes me that there's a role for philanthropy, but it's not always clear what that role should be. What are your thoughts on that now? Maybe you can take us a little bit on that journey that's taken you through these various places, because it's one thing to work in a university setting where hopefully you're creating a good and strong endowment, making it possible for people to attend who need a scholarship, but it's not necessarily going directly into that community of the projects in Bridgeport. And that's not to say that one thing is better or more important than another. It's just that they are different. And the problems you highlighted, especially with that inequality, are very, very apparent in a place like Connecticut where it's small. But writ large across the country, there are many roles for philanthropy, but it seems like there's a continual debate about whether or not it should be there at all, whether or not it largely benefits the wealthy, or whether philanthropy is the solution to our crises. So you've been through this journey a bit. What are your thoughts on the role for philanthropy, having grown up in it literally since you were in 3rd or 4th grade?
So I know we said we weren't going to get political, but I'm going to get political. I can't. You can't talk about how we organize ourselves as a community and without. So you touched on something that I think in our field is a minority position, but it's something I deeply hold. It's actually part of why I'm leaving philanthropy. I actually think philanthropy is part of the problem now. I think to take 2% of GDP and to apply it to helping others is beautiful when you look at it from a sort of a big picture. $500 billion, that's just extraordinary. You can do so much with that. Some very interesting data that as you go up the wealth ladder, you are less and less inclined to support charities that are actually direct social service, food banks, all those kind of things. You're more inclined to support universities, art museums, kind of, politics and more rarefied stuff that tends to preserve bastions of, places that are not accessible for most of the country. And I'm an idealist. I do believe that, if we can build computers that can talk to us, if we can, be knocking on the door of curing cancer, I think we could fix poverty. And I think if we were driven to do that as a common project, 2% of GDP is not going to do that, especially 2% of GDP that's directed by individuals as opposed to a coordinated, expert-informed, community-supported effort. I don't know. I think government is how, we exercise and move towards our desires for, a better life for all of us. So, I can't help but think, I think a lot of philanthropy is spent poorly. We have a lot of redundancy. 3+ million nonprofits in the country. That's a lot of duplication of services. It's not very efficient. Donors' choice, I have this mixed feeling. I think there is a community response, and I've seen this dozens of times, where we do rise to the occasion and we show up when there's a crisis and real urgency. But our attention span's short, and we move on to the next crisis, and we move on to the next project, and we go back to our little special interests. It's very hard to organize sustained support of really societal transformational programs that aren't sexy, quote unquote, in the marketing term. So, I've gotten a little disillusioned with philanthropy. I think there are heartening things, right? There's the humanity of it, that to witness people being generous, giving of their hard-earned money to help others is just, for me, that's sacred. It's just the most beautiful thing to witness in person. The fact that you can be in a household that is just above the poverty line in this country, and you're still giving 2% of your income away is it's the stories of people splitting their last piece of bread in a concentration camp and sharing it with another prisoner. It's beautiful, our instinct to take care of each other, even complete strangers. But I'm not so convinced anymore that our industry should exist in as substantial of a way. I think it should be a little icing on the cake. It shouldn't be the core of the solution.
Yeah, you've, I think, quoted somewhere a Dalai Lama quote about my religion is the religion of kindness, and you're kind of like modeling that, or at least in some of your descriptions right down. And I know you've been engaged in that personally. So one of the things that people may know about you if they Google you is that you have been a living organ donor. And some people may not know what that is, because for those of us who haven't done organ donation, it sounds like if you give it away, you're done. So first of all, could you describe what that means and how you came to start doing that? Because that sounds like another definition of philanthropy. I mean, certainly you're giving something that, you can barely afford to give to another so that they can live.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe the best way to tell this is as a story. So in October of 2015, still pretty formal about my Zen Buddhist practice. I would start my mornings at 5 o'clock. I had 2 hours of silent meditation. It closed with 20 minutes of, a ceremony, really, setting my intentions about what kind of human I wanted to be, how I wanted to help people, a review of my moral precepts and a reminder of those. And so I'd have these beautiful, kind of start to my day, getting spiritually centered and really trying to use that time to craft what kind of human I wanted to be. And in October of 2015, like many of us, after I finish my little morning routine, I pop up social media on my phone as I'm drinking my coffee and getting ready to go to work. And I see that my friend Wendy Doninger has announced that she was going to have surgery the next day. She was donating her kidney to her best friend's son. He's a 24-year-old active military, and he had a kidney disease, and he needed a new kidney. And she said this thing at the end of her post. It was roughly, if all I had to do was experience a minor inconvenience of surgery and a couple of days of recovery, but it was going to save somebody's life, how could I not do that? And I, being a little bit of a contrarian, the first thing I do is I jump on the internet, because there's absolutely no way a human being could exist with, one kidney without being in a constant state of medical crisis, right? You have two. Obviously, you have two for a reason. I start Googling. It turns out immediately you find out something like 4 or 5% of the population is only born with one kidney, and they go on with normal lives. They never know until maybe something later in life comes up that they find out. Actually, if you're thinking about donating a kidney, the very first thing they do before they even draw blood or interview you is they do a ultrasound scan just to even make sure you have two kidneys. But it turns out you can donate a kidney if you're healthy and have really essentially, other than if there are surgical complications, which are thankfully incredibly rare, you really don't need that second kidney. I had never had surgery. I was terrified of the idea of it. And for the next 2 months, every single morning, I spent 2 hours meditating in great distress. On one hand, I was terrified. I didn't want to do it. I was, how old was I? 34 at the time. Was jumping out of airplanes. I'm a runner. Like, I've got this, crazy job where I'm working 1 million hours a week. I had no interest in stopping and taking on a painful surgery, and God only knows what. I had a lot of fear there. And on the other hand, I have this beautiful religious tradition that is calling me to be the best version of myself and to help others, to actualize good and create good for others. And it was the longest period of serious deliberation I've ever had about something. And then, I started this conversation on spirituality with being a professed non-theist, and I'm very careful to use that language as opposed to an atheist, right? An atheist says there's absolutely nothing. A non-theist says, it's a little more of that intellectually curious agnostic space, like, there's not a God at the middle of my tradition, but there's something going on here. I took my first consulting job working with Northwell Health's Children's Hospital. And this was the very end of 2015. The foundation was on the first floor of a building in Queens, and the dialysis center was on the second floor. So I start walking in and out of this building as I'm in this deep deliberation process, watching people going for their treatments. And if you're not familiar with dialysis, it's really akin to any of us who have had family members going through chemo. It's really life limiting. You're tied to your infusion center. You can't travel. You're worn down and beaten up, and you can see it on their faces. My mother had breast cancer when I was 11 years old. She's fine now, but she was on, she had a mastectomy and a year of chemo, and that happened at a very formative age. And I could see my mother and her experience and her suffering and these dialysis patients. So I lost that consulting gig because I told them I needed time off to donate a kidney to one of their patients. So in January of 2016, I made a non-directed donation. Sometimes it was called an altruistic donation. At the time, I was doing it anonymously. I didn't want to meet the recipient. I didn't tell many of my family and friends. I certainly wasn't posting about it on social media. And I donated a kidney. It was a quick procedure. It was, 3 or 4 hours. I was out of the hospital in 36 hours after day 5. I wasn't even taking painkillers. I jumped out of my first airplane 27 days after the surgery. You go back to regular functioning in life after donating a kidney in an extraordinarily quick time. So that was my first organ donation. It was actually a disappointing experience.
What? Oh, wait. I want to hear about the disappointment, but I have to ask you about the itch.
Mm-hmm.
Because you described going through 2 months of thinking about this, but not really why. I mean, it's one thing to think that we have a responsibility to community, like you felt like since you were a child. It's another to dwell on this or meditate on it for 2 hours every morning to think, I've got to give up a part of my body to a person I've never met. What was the driving force behind that?
Yeah, so I'm going to have to take a big tour to answer that honestly, or detour to answer that honestly, and then I would like to come back to the disappointment part.
Please.
You probably got a snapshot from the way I described my childhood and my family. I had a wonderful life. No trauma, safety, 2 loving parents, great education, literally what you would dream for any child in the world. By the time I was 10, it was very clear that I was sad. I was sad in a way that my 3 siblings weren't, my classmates weren't. And by the time I was 13, I was being treated for depression. I had a pretty rough go of it there for a while. Unfortunately, that didn't culminate in an incident when I was 16. Unfortunately, it was only the beginning of a rough road, but I had a suicide attempt when I was 16. It was pretty serious, put me in the hospital for a couple of weeks. It's, I don't want to say a miracle that I'm alive, but it was, I got out of there by the skin of my teeth. And then struggled with my mental health for a good 7-8 years. Part of the reason I was part-time in college and graduated a little bit earlier is I was not functioning as a 17, 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old well. Addiction became some of that issue. I was drinking, using drugs, seeking relief from the misery that I was experiencing in the way that a lot of people do. And the problem with those of us who have struggled with suicide and suicidal ideation is, and this isn't necessarily a narrative just of depression, but there was a hopelessness. There was I don't matter. The world would be a better place. I would be better off if I was, dead. And very central to my recovery, and part of why, well, yes, I'm still treated for and will have to continue to work on my depression for the rest of my life. I still take an antidepressant. I still see a therapist regularly. I do a lot of wellness stuff that helps keep my depression at bay. The single most important thing I've done is work on developing meaning, purpose, and hope. I have, because of my career, because of some of my personal, volunteering, because of the way that I try to be in the world to my family and friends and strangers, I have built a resume that when I get to a dark place, it is absolutely impossible to believe the narrative that the world would be a better place without me. I've needed to do good in the world because it is deeply selfish. I'm convinced I wouldn't be here today if I didn't feel like, yeah, things may be hard right now, but there's people who count on me and I can still do a little bit of good. So that mental health journey and finding wellness, a lot of that revolved around being of service to others. Being of service to others is beautiful. It helps me more than I think it does other people. It takes me out of myself. It makes me focused on somebody else's humanity. I get filled with love and hope and connection as a result. And that is a great antidote to most mental illness.
So why the disappointment?
Yeah, so I just had a conversation about this with a $1 million donor I'm working with recently who wants her gift to be completely anonymous, and we were exploring whether or not that was a good fit for her. I had wanted to do a good thing that wasn't about my ego. I just kind of wanted to quietly do this. I wanted to get that little fix that I needed for, doing some good in the world. And I will also admit, I was on some Facebook groups that, were other kidney donors as I was kind of leading up to the surgery. And I was really uncomfortable with the idea of somebody feeling obligated to me. I remember this one post a woman made. She had donated to a 16-year-old young woman. And she said, I hope she goes off and goes to medical school and cures cancer. It was this whole, it was beautiful because her intention was to give somebody a life and to let them have all of that possibility in the future. But I read that and I went, shoot, that is a lot of pressure. Wait, so you helped me and now I have to achieve some, godlike ideal of saintliness to justify having received that kindness. I wanted my recipient to watch Netflix and I don't know, get to go out and have a beer with their friends and sleep too late on Saturdays. I didn't, and I was really uncomfortable with the idea of being thanked or having somebody think that I was, special in some way when, again, my motives were really, I know this sounds weird to say, but they were deeply selfish. I needed to do good. I needed to feel like what I was doing in life mattered. So I did it anonymously. And unfortunately, what my lived experience of that was, it was physically uncomfortable for a while. And then I got no validation either from the recipient or because only 6 or 7 people knew, people weren't gushing over me and patting me on the back and kind of validating that this was a worthwhile activity. So yeah, I kind of felt like I wouldn't even say disappointing. I would almost even go so far as to say it turned out to be a negative experience, especially doing it quietly. I hit the lottery. I had been in the bone marrow registry for 11 years at that point. I had done a cheek swab back in 2006. Turns out I had matched with a leukemia patient who needed, unfortunately, we don't do bone marrow very often anymore. We do it as stem cells, but still needed a whole new immune system. So I get this phone call. This is about a year after the kidney donation. Will you do the stem cell donation? You have to get some shots for 5 days, and then you do this, process that I always mispronounce, apheresis. It's like when you donate plasma, they take blood in, from one arm and out the other. It took about 5 hours, and it was such not a big deal that, quite frankly, I forgot about it. A year later, I got a phone call in 2018 from that same via the match registry, and they said, "Hey, your recipient is doing really well. She would like to meet you." I had no idea what they were talking about. Like, that's how, like, not a big deal the stem cell donation was. So a day later, I have this phone call with Jill out in California, and she texted me these pictures. Her family had a 1-year birthday party for her second life. And it was her with all of her grandkids and her 2 dogs, who she's now allergic to because she gets my dog allergies as a result of the stem cell donation. And it was so heartening to be a part of, to see I did this simple thing, and here this grandmother gets to continue to be in her kid's life. It was beautiful. So I called up the transplant center at Northwell where I had done my kidney donation, and every 6 months they had called me and said that my recipient wanted to meet, and I had always declined. And I said, I'm ready to meet my recipient. So I drove down to Queens, and I met Lance, and I'm sorry, it's still a little hard to talk about. I met this beautiful man with 8 kids who had immigrated here from Jamaica when he was 18. And every year, he and his church, he would organize a drive. He would go down with 20 plus full suitcases of toys and clothes, and he collected money. And, here was this father and this person who was doing good in the world, who talked about what being on dialysis was like, and how he couldn't travel. He couldn't do those trips anymore. His mother was sick, and he hadn't seen his mother. Sorry. He hadn't seen his mother in 4 years. And the day before he found out he was going to get a kidney in 2 days, because they don't tell recipients right up until the end, he had had a goodbye conversation with his mother. And he shows me a picture of, I'm sorry, Jared, give me just a second. I mean to get so emotional at 9:30 in the morning. He shows me this beautiful picture of the first time that he and his mother were reunited in Jamaica, about 6 months after he had gotten his kidney. And I have a mom that I love too. So getting to hear, getting to see that, getting to feel the joy of being part of something so special was extraordinary. And it created a terrible dilemma for me. By that point, I had been in these online Facebook groups where we supported other kidney donors for long enough to know that you could also donate a section of liver. Very, very different procedure. It's a full abdominal opening. It's a 10, 11 hour surgery. We were in the hospital for 8 to 10 days. It's 4 to 6 months to full recovery. Very few people do it. There's about 3 altruistic liver donors a year. There's only about 120 of us who have both donated kidney and liver. And I was stuck in exactly that same place now in 2018 that I had been in 2015. How could I, as a healthy young person without kids, hold on to something that would be an inconvenience, in this case, not a minor inconvenience, but would only be an inconvenience, and could save somebody else's life. So I spent a few months and I went through the same cycle. I was terrified. I didn't want to do it. And one thing led to the next, and ended up donating a section of liver at UPMC out in Pittsburgh. A beautiful man named Marty. And this time I got to do it publicly. I talked about it on Facebook. I announced when I matched and it was successful and I had a surgery date. I talked with my friends and family about how scared I was going into the surgery. I got to talk about why creating meaning and purpose in my life was so important to me. I had care packages waiting for me when I showed up in recovery. I had friends who helped me drive me places when I was recovering from surgery. I had this beautiful experience. I got to see immediately this other life transformed by the donation. I got to have the love and support of my family and friends while I was going through a hard thing. And I got to tell a story about, the good stuff. Every time we turn on the news, every time we open Facebook, it's all of the challenging stuff. So the doing it publicly, getting a chance to have both experiences. I don't like being the center of attention, right? It's not, I get my validation, from my family and friends and internally. I don't need a spotlight for that. And if anything, probably a little uncomfortable in the spotlight. But getting to share the story about who I was and why I was doing this and what it was like with people. And the reason I still talk about it publicly now, 4 years later, is I wouldn't have known to do this, that it was possible, if my friend Wendy hadn't talked about it. And why do we just talk about the bad stuff? Why aren't we celebrating the good stuff? And that's the conversation I had with the donor. You're doing this extraordinary thing. Everybody who knows you knows you have money. You live in a mansion on, a fancy part of town. It's not like anybody's going to be surprised that you have money. Why are we hiding that you're doing this incredibly generous thing that is a choice that is going to make a really beautiful and, transformative impact on people's lives? So, yeah, I've gone from, do good things in private and quietly to do things loudly with a bullhorn and jumping up and down by a billboard on I-95.
Although if you actually got a billboard, I'd love to see that. That's for people who don't know, I-95 is full of them, and we could use a few with good news. But the other part of jumping up and down is the other thing you alluded to now, at least twice in our conversation, and the thing that people can find out about you, but they won't necessarily know why. And it may seem counterintuitive, or even some people might say it's, contradictory, that you are so devoted to these things you've been describing about your purpose and validating your purpose through these acts that you've undertaken. And yet you get in an airplane, you go up in the air and you jump out of that thing and you do it over and over and over. And you've done this 2,000 times, which I guess for thrill seekers sounds like a lot of fun. But to many of us, we probably think, if you fought so hard to live and fight so hard to prove your life is valuable by helping others, why in the world would you risk it by jumping out of an airplane repeatedly?
So, yeah, there's, like anything, there's some risk associated, but I'll share a stat that should both be comforting and should also horrify us about a larger societal problem. There is one fatality skydiving for every about 410,000 skydives.
Wow, that's even probably better risk than a shark attack or something, right? So.
You're starting to get into that kind of rarefied air and territory. There's 22 fatalities for every 100,000 pregnancies. It is 88 times more dangerous to get pregnant in the United States than it is to jump out of an airplane. It says something pretty terrible about how our healthcare infrastructure doesn't treat 90% of the country as well as it does the top 10%. So there's some damning social commentary in there. And I think it helps people, we don't run up to pregnant women and say like, oh my gosh, you're crazy. You're trying not to live. And we should be very genuinely worried about their life and their well-being when somebody's pregnant, especially if you're Black, especially if you're not rich and college educated in this country, as the majority of people aren't. So one, I think it's much safer. It's so safe that I think it takes a little bit of the adventure out. Yes, it is scary the first time you jump out of an airplane, but it actually becomes incredibly normal. And I think one of the things that most surprises people is After about my 20th skydive, there was no longer any fear getting in the door. I wouldn't even call it thrill seeking. It wasn't adrenaline. I would say it was more akin to an extension of my Zen practice. So much about my Zen practice is just authentically, fully, and completely being where I am in the present moment. And I think when we're doing that, we're putting aside ego and we're most open and receptive. We can be the most generous, best version of ourselves. It takes me 20, 30, 40 minutes before sitting in meditation, before my, little chatter in my brain starts to settle down and I can really be in the present moment. I jump out of an airplane and even after 2000 jumps, I am nowhere else, right? And it's this beautiful thing. We do it in community. We do it with our friends. It's out in nature. I think those of us who have spent our whole life on the ground are missing out on the fact that the majority of nature, the majority of our planet is actually, these many miles between the Earth and outer space that we have. It smells different at different altitudes. The quality of the air is different. You can feel the temperature change as you, fall through the air. Is a beautiful way to be in nature. There's nowhere in the country that isn't a spectacular view from, 2 miles off of the face of the earth. And then to be liberated in that way, to get to literally fly like a bird, is just an extraordinary gift. So I started, was doing it for fun about 3 years ago. I started competing. I'm sort of semi-professional in this way of being hired by competitive teams to fly video for competitive skydiving teams, which has allowed me to, fly all around the country and work with some of the, best athletes in the world, which has been, pretty extraordinary. It's been an extraordinary gift.
And I know you've been able to do some for social good too, like jumps for cancer and things of that nature.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly grabs attention. You post on Facebook about what you're eating for the day and you get 3 likes, and you post on Facebook that you're jumping out of an airplane, and every jump you make, you're going to donate $100 to charity, and you're asking people to match you. And there's a whole lot more people paying attention when you're jumping out of an airplane than eating your lunch. So it is something I've tried to use to raise money for some of the causes I care about.
Part of the conversation here has centered not just on spirituality, but about the practice. And you've talked about it in terms of everything from the monastery to, it sounds like that kind of presence of mind when you're jumping, because you're there. And obviously through the journey of these donations that you've made, live organ donations. Is that also a part of what's taken you from our world of philanthropy and fundraising to then fully invest yourself into the practice of mental health? Because this is a journey you've taken personally. You've also spent a lot of time studying this. I think you're just getting or have just gotten your PhD. But this is also another leap, and not a leap of faith, I guess a leap of practice or discipline or something. So why this now, and where does this fit in your journey? Where is it taking you next?
Yeah, I love that you made the connection to skydiving, because I was so scared to jump out of that first airplane that I really learned a valuable lesson that, courage only exists in the face of fear. It's hard to be in your 40s to give up. Look, I've been a chief development officer, an AVP. I've been making good money in fundraising for a while now, and it's an extraordinary gift to be able to have that kind of comfort and safety that goes along with life. We do not pay our mental health care workers very much. What skydiving taught me is that through competency, I can gain confidence. And learning how a parachute system worked, learning about the safety procedures. When we jump out of an airplane, part of the reason it's safe is because it's so high. If I'm having a malfunction at 5,000 feet, I still have 26 seconds before at terminal velocity I get to the ground. I can clear that entire first parachute system, and I have a reserve. I have backup. And I get to start a brand new skydive all over from scratch at that point. So learning and really understanding recognizing that I'm still going to have fear, that my emotional life is going to take a little while to catch up with that intellect. But I can still do things that I'm scared of if I've prepared and taken that seriously. That skydiving gave that to me 10 years ago, and it's allowed me to, as an adult, take a really, serious, next jump off of a ledge. I had started a PhD in developmental psychology, really because I was in a bit of a career reset, and I had taken a little time off of work after that kidney donation. I was consulting, and I wanted to get back into the field as a practitioner, not as a consultant. And I thought at that point I had a master's in education. A PhD would look good next to my name. And if I wanted to be a VP of development somewhere, the Wikiffer numbers, it used to be like 5% of VPs, chief development officers had PhDs. And the last time I looked, 6 or 7 years ago, it was already up to 35%, something like that. I don't know what the current numbers are. But I was like, gosh, I want to run a fundraising shop one day. Like, I should get those letters next to my name. So that was my pure motivation. I enjoyed research a touch in my master's. I started this doctoral program, and I really fell in love with psychology. It helped me understand the journey I had been going through. My research is in behavior change and habit formation. So really working with people to be able to create the healthy habits that can support their mental health. And it became very clear in that research journey that if I wanted to actually help people with this, I needed to be clinically licensed. So in a roundabout way, after the doctorate, I'm now getting a master's in clinical mental health care. So I just gave up my last, on Friday of this past week, my last W-2 job as a major gift officer for Connecticut Children's Hospital. I'm in my internship year, so I do 20 hours a week working with clients for free, by the way, for this year. Talking about that money, going from a full-time job to, finding consulting around the edges to make ends meet. While I mostly work for free. So my journey, my spiritual journey, the research really kind of igniting the love for that work. I'm hoping next month I'm going to successfully defend that doctorate. And in May of 2025, I will, be able to sit for licensing exams as a licensed professional counselor.
I'm curious, what would Dr. Cernera say to that kid, that teenager who is trying to figure this out?
Yeah, so fortunately, the Dr. Cernera that was in my life first, my father, said a lot of really wonderful things. That's an interesting question. Things that are worth doing are worth working hard at. And the things that are worth doing aren't easy. And not to be scared of that. I think not looking for the easy way out, recognizing there's no way around something, there's only through it or up and over it. But, you got to do the work. And doing the work provides great benefits. And I'm grateful to be able to do the work today.
Well, that's it for this episode of the Philanthropy Masterminds podcast. If you or someone you know is having thoughts of suicide or experiencing a mental health crisis, call 988 for a direct connection to free, confidential, and compassionate support. And to learn more about living organ donation, visit organdonor.gov. Our thanks to our sponsor, DonorSearch, the world leader in fundraising intelligence solutions, and of course our producer, Jack Frost. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, the DonorSearch YouTube channel, or wherever you like to listen. And consider giving us a like and a positive review so others can find us as well. Check out our live webinars and webcasts on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and come back next weekend for another interview with a leader in the world of social good. Until then, this is Jay Frost. Thanks so much for joining me. See you next time.